Hi, my name is Marco Cantù. Welcome to this CodeRage 7 session on using jQuery with DataSnap REST Applications. My name is Marco Cantù, and I'm a Delphi book author and Delphi guru. You can follow my blog and Twitter account for news. And if you look for information about my books, you can refer to my old website or static website, www.marcocantu.com. What we are going to see in this session is a very short introduction to DataSnap REST and the idea behind REST. I'll shortly guide you through some of the key elements of JavaScript and why you want to use JavaScript. But then we'll rapidly move to jQuery, see some of the concepts of jQuery, see a short demo of the mobile version of jQuery, and then focus on extending the existing DataSnap REST architecture by using jQuery and eventually plugging in some extra support code. So the starting point is REST, or representational state transfer. It's an approach, it's not a standard. It's an approach that dictates that you communicate with server-side components or server-side objects through interfaces that are based on URLs. URLs are used to identify individual components, and then you call and ask for representations, different representation of the objects referenced by these URLs. It's completely stateless model, and in fact it adapts very nicely to the use of HTTP as the protocol for implementing REST, which is the universal protocol used for implementing REST. In simple terms, what you do on the server to create a REST server, you create an HTTP server that, depending on the URL you call into, will return either XML or JSON for the data structures. It's all kept extremely simple. You basically use the URL path or URL parameters or other features of HTTP, like for security or related elements. And what you get back is a plain response, again based either on JSON or XML. So this is a way to create web services that, unlike SOAP, is extremely simple, straightforward, but on the negative side, it lacks a standard configuration and a really standard implementation model. It's an architecture, it's an approach that you can use to implement a similar mechanism. Now, what DataSnap provides as a REST server is a mechanism to map URLs, incoming URL requests, to classes, methods, and their parameters. So you can simply create classes and expose methods of these classes to make it easy to call them through HTTP. It's kind of a remote method invocation mechanism that's available for your objects. It uses JSON for all purposes. So you receive JSON data structures and return JSON data structure. There is automatic mapping of JSON to some of the standard data types like integer strings, and even some of the more complex types like tables. But you can also just use the JSON classes that are part of the DBX JSON unit and pass TJSON objects or TJSON arrays back and forth between your client applications and your server-side applications. Now, the specific area I'm going to focus in this session, which is not the only area, you can use DataSnap REST server as a backend for a mobile application, for example. But here I'm focusing only on using JavaScript as the client. So using the browser as the client for a DataSnap REST application. So how does this work in practice? I think the best way is to have a look at a brand new application generated with Delphi XC3. So I'm just go for new, other. I'll pick a DataSnap REST application, which is a DataSnap application with the core infrastructure of the client browser-based JavaScript application as well. So it's basically kind of two sides, and they are both available, while if you just pick a plain DataSnap server, you get only the server side but nothing in terms of client support. So I'm going to pick the defaults, a standalone BCL application, pick any available port, just go for the basic features and go for it. You pick a T component and use a standard folder for deployment, and that's fine. And this is our application. It has a basically useless form. Well, it is useful because internally it has code that you might need for the infrastructure, but it's not where you write your code, of course. There is a web module that has the infrastructure. It has a bunch of components that make up your structure, starting with the DataSnap server component itself. The server class, which is a class factory, the server class refers to the class you actually want to expose, which is, by default is called tServerMethods1. The web module has also a reverse string component. It's a page producer component that is connected to an HTML file. You can see the graphical design here, but we also want to have a look at the code, and the code has HTML and also has got a bunch of JavaScript. What we are actually looking for is that there is a button with an on-click event handler, on reverse string click. This is a method that's being called. And if we go into the on reverse string click and just ignore the login support for now, what we get is code that will fetch a value from the value field element, the element with the value field ID, which is this one, this input, and call the reverse string method. Reverse string method is one of the methods exposed by our server-side class. So this is how you tie in your JavaScript client server methods reverse string to your server-side method, which basically does a reverse string operation. Okay, so if we run this and go past the Windows firewall and we open a browser, what we can do is call our reverse string method. Okay, and we can also optionally put a breakpoint here to say that this is really what is being called. We can also easily change the behavior of our application, the logical behavior, doing something different, and then if we run this again, now in the page we get the new behavior with the asterisk being added at the beginning or the end of the string. So that's just the core idea of how the DataSnap REST server works. What I want to focus on is the client side more than the server side in this session. And the client side, of course, is JavaScript. This is one of the most relevant languages today, although it's a little old, well, as old as Delphi. That's kind of interesting that in '95 there were a few languages designed which are still relevant today: JavaScript, Java, and Delphi. Anyway, JavaScript is not technically called JavaScript, it's called ECMAScript because it's a standard by ECMA, which is a Swiss standard body. Now, why we want to use JavaScript? Because that's the language of browser applications. Yes, you might want to try to stay away from it and use a tool that generates JavaScript for you, and there are many different options I don't really want to get into right now. But you might as well also learn JavaScript and figure out where is the power of this language, because it is a powerful language. It's very different from the static compile languages most developers are used to, but it's an interesting language. And interesting in JavaScript has been growing because of the Ajax model that let you create browser applications and not just use it within websites. The significant increase JavaScript has had in terms of processing of the last few years, the growth of JavaScript libraries. I mean, using JavaScript without a library is just like writing code with Delphi against the Windows API. It's not a nice experience. And the growth of HTML5 and its power, the extension of the REST model, that is really a good model for JavaScript invocation, and also the increased role of the JSON format. This is actually not much of an cause of JavaScript, of the increased use of JavaScript is actually an effect. So by using more and more JavaScript, people move more and more to JSON, because JavaScript object notation is the format that JavaScript can use to represent its in-memory objects as a stream, as a text file. So before we get into jQuery, let's do a very, very short introduction of JavaScript. And I'm really trying to keep this extremely short. It's a case-sensitive language, differently from Delphi. It's an imperative language like Delphi. You run statements in a sequence. It's a dynamic language, so RTTI is built into the ground of the language. It's object-based and not class and not class-based. Hasn't got inheritance. Hasn't even got the concept of class, but it has a very, very pervasive concept of objects. It's functional, but then the beauty is the ability to access to the document object model that you have available. Now let me show you an example of some JavaScript code. Here is a very short demo which uses JavaScript in a traditional old-fashioned way with script that write to the document. That's not what you generally do. It's a case-sensitive language. You need to use things properly. It's an imperative language. You write if statements, for loops, while loops, and operate in sequences. And again, the syntax is more or less the C language syntax for most of the core features. But you can also create objects. You just say that an object is a new object, and that's it. You don't have to declare the class. You assign new values to object fields, and those fields come to existence when you assign values to them. If rather than assigning an integer or a string, you assign a function to a field, the field becomes a method, and you can invoke it with the standard method invocation notation. There's another thing that's relevant, that you can access fields with object.fieldName, like in most other languages, but you can also access fields with object square bracket a string with the field name. And this is like using RTTI and getting a property by name in Delphi if we want to create a parallel. And also everything is an object, like a string is an object. So you can write text.length. Now we can do that in Delphi actually 3 as well, treating a string as an object. But in this case it's different because the string is really an object. You can have functions. You can write and call functions this way, which looks like the traditional way. But what you're actually doing with this declaration is mostly something like this, which is similar to anonymous method in Delphi. In fact, anonymous methods are, it's really a feature that comes from JavaScript, and it's one of the foundations of JavaScript. But again, the real power comes from the ability to access the DOM, although the core raw access to the DOM by JavaScript is again like using the Windows API. It's possible, but very cumbersome. There are libraries that help you make the DOM access part of JavaScript much better, much easier, and overall a nicer experience, and also help you create structure for your code, improve this overall structure of your code. That's why, beside looking into what Delphi provides in terms of JavaScript support, which is mostly this unit that has the interfaces for the server-side functions available in the application. This is through a proxy generator tied to the JavaScript REST language. If we get back to the previous Delphi application and to the web module unit, we can see here that there is a proxy generator component that is set to generate JavaScript for the proxy client for the server application. This is returned to the client application, and what the client application uses to invoke the server-side functions. So there is support for JavaScript, but again, we don't want to limit ourselves to JavaScript. We want to do one extra step, which is adopt one of the JavaScript libraries. Now, there are many JavaScript libraries. I'm not implying in any way jQuery is the best JavaScript library, but it's a very good JavaScript library for sure, and the one I've adopted over the last few years. It's managed by a foundation. It has strong support by some big players like Google, Microsoft, Mozilla Foundation, so it's not kind of getting out of nowhere. It's being actively developed, and it's a significant open source project, not just a minor one. And it's completely open. It's completely open source, completely available. So what we can do here is introduce jQuery, and then we'll do what's written in this slide, which is we'll clean up the JavaScript code of jQuery Delphi REST application, of a Delphi REST application using jQuery. But first, let's focus on some of the basics of jQuery. jQuery basically has one object that is the foundation of jQuery, which is called jQuery, but there is a shortcut for it, which is just using the $sign. So when you're seeing the $sign, what you're seeing is there is an object passed as parameter, and this object is being wrapped by jQuery, so you can call any jQuery method on top of an object that's already as a part of your document object model or of your application in general. Now you can pass an object to the function, but mostly you pass a string with a selector, and you can select, as you can see here, by ID, by class, or by tag. There are universal data access functions to access a value or the HTML, read and write the value, the HTML, or an attribute of any object. There are visual operations like hide, show, toggle, and many others. And finally, you can plug in events. You can attach anonymous methods as events to your user interface objects. Now, this can be done in terms of our DataSnap REST application, extending it. So rather than doing it live, I'll just reopen an existing application that I've already extended by plugging in JavaScript. Again, same architecture, same structure. Everything is very similar. I've added jQuery. If we open the template, I've added jQuery as one of the JavaScript files that are used by this application. And then what I've done is I've modified the code. Now, the first thing is here, the call in the reverse string button. Now, what I've done here is quite remarkable, even if it's very simple in practice, which is I've removed any reference from the reverse string button, the reverse button to the code. Now, one interesting feature of jQuery is it really pushes and favor separation of code from the UI. In the previous version, there was some tie-in of the UI of that button with the code. Now, there's no tie-in, there's no reference to the code from the UI, so a graphic designer can change and alter this UI, can replace this button with something completely different. The only thing that has to be kept around to tie in later the code is the ID. But of course, you can use reverse button even if the object is not a button, but is something completely different. And now jQuery has a special function. It's called document ready, which is where you install the behavior of the intended application of your JavaScript code to the UI after the UI has finished loading. And what we are doing here, we are adding an anonymous method tied to the click event of the reverse button. And what we do here is somehow similar to what was done before. Of course, rather than get document by ID, we just use $ with a pound, but we use the val function to read and write the value, but it's not much difference from what we were doing before. It's just there's a cleaner separation, there's a slightly improved way of coding, and of course we should get the same behavior. But what I've also changed in this demo is the CSS, the cascading style sheet, because the one that you get by default is really bare bones, it's really empty. So I've changed it to get the new behavior here. Now, one interesting side of using jQuery in terms of development for applications is to keep the use of a Delphi DataSnap REST server and then replace your HTML markup with the jQuery mobile markup and its specific cascading style sheets. So what you can end up with is an application that has a user interface not meant for the browser, but meant for mobile devices. Sorry about that. So here, what I'm doing, I have this application. This is again a DataSnap REST application that hooks to database. And what it does, it has a UI that doesn't make a lot of sense at this size because it's meant to be a UI working at a much smaller and vertical size like you'll get on a phone. So there's a reverse code, there is an employee list, there's a REST function returning a list, and then this creates dynamically the HTML for the list. The list has filters. That's a feature of jQuery mobile, and then you can pick an element and get a new page or a new sub page, because what actually happens, you have a single HTML file with multiple pages, and you can implement movement from one page to the other with this side scrolling effect that's mostly tied to the iOS user interface. Okay, and in terms of code, if we look at the Delphi application behind it, we still have the web module client, which is somehow similar. We still have the server methods that, of course, have some extra code, like the ability to run a query and create a JSON array with the name, with the departments and the employees. This is some complex code on the server side to simplify the client-side management. And in terms of client, what we have in this template is code that is not meant for it's not plain HTML, because if we look at the markup, it has specifically the structures and the data role elements that are part of jQuery Mobile. So these are the 3 pages, and then there is JavaScript code that will make the request, like get the list of the employees and create the HTML based on the information received from the REST call. So that's the demo. We surface database data through the DataSnap REST application, and then we create the jQuery mobile client side. And this can run very nicely on both iOS and Android as clients. Now there is actually more than you can do in terms of pushing for the using JavaScript, using jQuery on the client side. An example is the ability to create an application that will manage objects and return and let you edit objects on the client. So what this application has is a server-side module that can return a list of objects. It's a list of tMyData object, very simple data structure here. And also I've implemented the 4 methods for getting the value, updating the value, which is the post operation, creating a new value, which is the put operation in HTTP, or the delete HTTP operation. This mapping is automatic, the mapping of these 4 HTTP methods to 4 function names with the URL remaining my data for each of them. So there's some automatic mapping that you can override and customize in your DataSnap REST server apps. So here I'm just returning a given element or updating it or canceling it, and the data structure I move back and forth is always JSON objects, or in case of the list, a JSON array. In the client of this application, we have JavaScript code that, for example, when we do a refresh list, will get the list of the elements, and from the list of the elements we'll create a number of anchors with new lines. And after doing that, it will install an event handler for each of the anchors, part of this list, and the anonymous method installed basically calls myData to fetch the information. And so it returns JSON and transforms that JSON into a in-memory JavaScript object, and then it has a helper function to transform that JavaScript object to move that JavaScript object to the user interface. And the effect is something like this. Get the test object, and this is our test object. Of course, you can refresh the list, but it doesn't do much. We can create new objects. We can delete existing objects. We can update the value of an object. All through JavaScript calls to the server, and then mapping of the user interface elements to this user interface. Mapping of the objects, of the JSON objects to this user interface. Now, if we look at this demo, it has much more. It has not just 2 fields, it has many fields. So if we think about writing all of the code to map each individual field of the JavaScript object to the UI, that is somehow time consuming. So what I've actually done here, I've used a helper that it's invoked from here. I use a helper class in Delphi that can go through the RTTI of the class, that tMyData or that employee class, company class, and actually can do 2 things. It can create the a skeleton user interface, which is what you are seeing here. This is a dynamically generated skeletal UI or scaffolding. And the other thing it can do, it can generate some mapper classes. It can generate a function that's called myData to tform and form to tMyData that again, uses RTTI using the list of the published properties and generates JavaScript that will map the values of the published properties to the corresponding elements of the user interface. So the idea is to generate JavaScript that helps you manage the user interface mapping and also potentially validation and other features. I've actually extended this kind of initial demo into a full framework that has a Razor clone that expands on the page producer, has extended sessions management, some support for active record, and also this support for generating JavaScript jQuery mapping code for UI operations and for client-side validation of the server-side data, all based on the data structures, all based on the Delphi objects, the RTTI for these Delphi objects, and some attributes that you can use to mark up and to request special JavaScript features just by marking attributes. Like validation is all attributes driven. You mark specific fields with requests like this is an email, there is a specific attribute, and the system will automatically generate the code for you. You can have a look at the source code and some documentation on codemarcocantu.com/p-relax until I move it to a different hosting server. So as a conclusion, this is a clean, robust, and modern architecture. The separation of the user interface from the JavaScript, the separation of the client side, HTML and JavaScript, from the REST server side. It's difficult. It requires learning a number of different technologies. So it's not a simple and trivial way to create browser applications with Delphi, but it's a very robust, powerful, and scalable way of creating such applications. It would be nice to have better integrated tools, but you can already start using HTML Builder for the client side of your Delphi DataSnap REST application. There is still room to grow. There are still extensions that could be done to make it more powerful, but it's a significant model in terms of development. And also the same approach will help you create mobile clients that hook into those same REST servers and call them, but rather than having JavaScript on the client, will have a native application. So if you have any further question or information, just talk to me in the coming Q&A here live at CodeRage, or if you are listening to a recorded version, just send me email at my address. Thanks and bye.
So we've got Marco Cantu, Delphi Product Manager, here in the studio live, and obviously this presentation was pre-recorded before the announcement was made. So welcome.
Thanks.
If you have a standard FireMonkey desktop application and you want to add a DataSnap to it, is it easy to do right away, or is it better to start with a clean DataSnap project and add in the older parts?
I'm not sure I fully understand, but there are two sides of DataSnap. I mean, you might want to have your FireMonkey application as a client for a DataSnap server. So at that point, you'll create a project group, and the two applications are separate. I mean, a DataSnap application generally hasn't got a UI. It's something you run on a server. It has UIs in demos because it's easy to demo, and to debug as well, if you pick the VCL-based application, but you generally deploy it as a server. So on the other side, what you want to have is a FireMonkey application that acts as a REST client. And at that point, all you have to do is you create an existing app, and you go to DataSnap, you add a client, either a traditional DataSnap client or a REST DataSnap client, that will generate a data module for you and fully integrate with your user interface.
Do you know if JavaScript supports inline functions?
I don't know exactly. JavaScript functions are quite different from like functions as we use in Delphi, because functions are objects that have the code attached. So it's kind of a different word. Basically, all JavaScript functions, as I mentioned, are anonymous methods, if we want to do a comparison, more than traditional kind of Pascal functions for methods. So it's a bit of a different world.
How do I interact in T web browser with a submit button without ID or name, but a class name used in several places, but with a unique on-click event and a unique on-change event?
If you mean in terms of jQuery, there are ways to navigate through controls. So it's not, of course, the most common approach to refer to an element in the DOM is by either ID, name, or something. But you can actually navigate the tree. So you can say, I don't know, suppose you have, the container. You can have, I want the div that contains this button, and then go to the first sub-element. And if this happens to be the button, that's your button. Of course, you have to know exactly the HTML layout, and if that changed, you are really at a loss, because there's nothing more you can do to fix the application. But it's possible to plug into and just navigate through the DOM, like by position rather than by name or by ID.
Does DataSnap have, or does a DataSnap REST server have good scalability?
Well, yes and no. It has scalability, meaning if being completely stateless and having the session data structure that are extremely small, if you have a good, physical server with good bandwidth, you can probably handle, a large number of requests per minute. But if scalability means, I want to be able to have like 10 servers and share the workload, that's a bit tricky because of the way the session itself is managed. I'm going to have a webinar in, I think, about 3 weeks about this specific topic, and I'm going to get, and there's also going to be a small, a short white paper. So I'm going to provide some details in that direction. But again, it's not that out of the box. It's easy to scale it. I'd like to have that feature added, and we are kind of already started thinking of how to add this in the future. Of course, that's from the product manager perspective, not from the user.
There you go. This question is asking about replays in HD. Depends what you mean by HD. If you mean 1080p, then the answer is no. The recordings are, for the most part, 1280 by 1024, so that would be slightly better than 720p, which is still HD, I believe. So on the server side, is it possible to make it more REST-like by customizing the URL scheme of the DataSnap server so as not to expose the class and method names?
It is possible. There is a specific event handler on the server side that lets you do URL mapping in some sort of free way, not completely free. You still have to have 2 tokens, or there are even ways to have a single token that maps to class name.method. But somehow the architecture is not that bad. The only thing, of course, you don't want to have tserver methods 1, but you want to have a name, probably even without the T, a name that would match nicely to the URL. At times that's enough to separate yourself from have nicer looking URLs. But mapping is possible. It could be easier for sure, but mapping is possible today.
If you have any more questions, feel free to put them in now. I have one more left in here in the queue, and that is, has Delphi Relax changed due to improvements in Delphi XE2 or XE3?
Not fully, because probably the main sponsor and and developer using the project is stuck on XE. So trying to make it XE compatible. There are a few things that won't be needed anymore, because they were kind of workarounds for bugs that have been fixed. From XE2 to XE3, the difference is not huge. I've updated some of the demos. I'm not sure if I've posted all of them, but it's mostly a matter. Backwards compatibility is absolutely good. From XE2 to XE3, there's been actually even very, very few changes. There's only the unit DS session you have to reference, and that's basically it. From XE to 2, there was some significant fixes, including like parameters management and other things. So yeah, it would make sense to have a version that's fully tuned, but of course that was really kind of a side project that was not really the chance for. I mean, if dev or supporting multiple versions, we kept it like the common ground and making sure it works throughout XC, XC2, XC3.
All right, there are no more questions, so thank you very much, Marco. Anything you want to add to this talk?
No, well, the kind of thing that I want to add is that there is one of my goals in the coming months is to figure out how to extend, improve the existing DataSnap architecture, both the traditional one and the REST one. So if you have like ideas, suggestions, real-world experiences, I mean, if you have actually built an application based on this architecture that's used in the real world, I'd be interested to hear your feedback. So just an email and I'll get it done.
Sounds great. And as I've done before, you can put a dot between Marco and Cantu here, marco.cantu, and an @ embarcadero.com.
Yep, that's it.
All right. Thank you very much, Marco.
Okay, you're more than welcome.